Faith communities are a very important component in any action which occurs on a subject like climate change. I was talking with Rick Warren recently in California, who has a very 20,000 member church. He gave the prayer before Obama's introduction, and he has a great peace plan, and he dreams of Christian churches around the world getting together. He says, the biggest single body of people you could get together is, because Christian churches exist in so many places. And he wasn't just limiting it to Christian churches. He says we can work with anybody of goodwill, we can work with other religions, we can work with everybody who's prepared to come and take these problems seriously. And he's training people out of his 20,000 member church to be taking action in the third world in various ways. So it's very good to see action occurring. I have a very large American church in that way. But first of all, a bit of science, just to summarize some of the science to you, if I may. There's compelling evidence that the world is warming. And the climate changing, largely because of human activities, because we're burning coal and oil and gas, we're making carbon dioxide, which gets into the atmosphere, increases the amount of that gas, which is a blanket over the Earth's surface, makes the blanket thicker and makes us warmer. The effect has been known for over 200 years. The physics of it is absolutely sound, and we can work it out in a general sense pretty accurately indeed. Increased temperature, of course, doesn't sound a bad thing to happen, especially on a cold day, but if it's increased temperature on average around the world, that is a big problem. And why? Because it will tend to make climate extremes get more common and more intense. In Central Europe in 2003, there was an intense heat wave of an unprecedented intensity, which led to the premature deaths of at least 20,000 people. Some people say 35,000 were killed in that process. So when I and others began to talk about climate change being a weapon of mass destruction, and when people told me I was off my head and I was just getting old or something and trying to hype it up in my old age, I said, not at all. If 20,000 people die in a single event, that really is a big number, and it really means that we're facing a very big threat indeed. And it isn't just, of course, heat waves that are a problem. Very simply, if we increase the temperature, average temperature of the Earth, we increase the average temperature of the ocean surface, we increase the amount of water vapor being evaporated from the ocean, we increase the amount of water in the atmosphere, we increase the amount of the average precipitation, and we're seeing that happening at the moment. Average rainfall is increasing. But when water vapor condenses in the atmosphere to form clouds, if you remember your schoolgirl or schoolboy physics, you will know a lot of latent heat is released. And that latent heat is actually the largest single source of energy for the atmosphere's circulation. And that means if you increase the amount of energy, you are increasing the intensity of the hydrological cycle, and that means we're going to get more intense rainstorms, more floods, and it means also we're going to get drier air and more droughts. So more floods and more droughts are on the way, and they're going to get more intense, and they're going to get longer, and it's going to be a very big problem, especially in some parts of the world. And then, of course, because we're melting ice in the polar regions also, that's adding to the sea level rise, and the fact that the oceans are getting warmer, that's adding to the sea level rise too, because ocean expands as it heats, and we're in for the order of 1 meter per century of sea level rise. And those climate change impacts are already evident. Within a few decades, they're going to severely affect billions of people around the world. For instance, in the sea level rise, we'll have big problems in the east of our country. In East Anglia, we'll have big problems, have to spend billions on doing something about it. Even in Wales, we're going to have to spend quite a lot of money. Go to Bangladesh, however, And there are 10 million people living below the 1 meter contour. And where do those people go? They're not going to be allowed into India because the fence is being built along that frontier. And 25 million people in southern China are going to be affected and homeless as a result too, not to mention all the people in the islands in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. A lot of people there are going to be displaced also. Big problem. And then because of these climate extremes, particularly in the subtropical regions, where people can't really cope with it, floods and droughts are the biggest disasters the world knows. They cause more average economic loss, more misery, more deaths than any other disasters on average that we know. So more of them, and more intense ones, is very bad news, especially for people in some of the poorer parts of the world. The most frightening statistic I know concerns droughts. And this is some work at the Hadley Centre at the Met Office, careful modelling work, which has substantial scientific credibility. That is trying to say just how bad a drought's going to get this century. If you take the usable land area of the world at the moment, at any one time, something like 2 or 3% of that land area is under what is called extreme drought, which is the classification of drought that's most extreme. 20 years ago, it was 1%. By 2050, it's likely to be 10 or 12%. Imagine the impact of that on the poorer parts of the world. And that's just talking about the effects on people. There's also the effects on ecosystems. The non-human creation is going to suffer because they can't adapt fast enough to cope with the rates of change we're talking about. Rates of change which are faster than the Earth has experienced, probably for millions of years. So we're going to lose millions of species. And that's a pretty bad legacy to leave from our generation, isn't it? That was the generation who lost millions of species. Not a good idea at all. I could say more about that, but I'm not a biologist, so I'll leave that to other people to talk about. But it's bad enough when you think about the effects on the world's poorest people. And that immediately raises an issue of justice and an enormous moral imperative. If you were sitting in the first meeting at Copenhagen in a month's time, there might well be a picture on the board of the per capita emissions of carbon dioxide from all the nations or groups of nations in the world. On the left-hand side, you will discover you will have the United States, and then a few countries like that, who are emitting something like 30 tons per head of population. You move along the histogram that you might see is Europe, putting something more like 10 or 15 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Move along a bit further and you get China, perhaps something like more like 5 or 6. And then India and parts of Africa at the far end with more like 2 or 3. And the question, of course, in front of the delegates is how do we share carbon emissions around the world? What is the basis of our sharing? How can we come to a fair solution of the problem that faces us? And it makes an immediate moral imperative for the Western world, for the rich world, when we realize that we've had 200 years of burning coal and oil and gas. We've grown wealthy from that coal and oil and gas. That's the reason why we're so wealthy. We've had all this cheap energy over 200 years. We didn't realize the damage we were causing until very recently. We didn't realize that that damage would fall disproportionately on the poorer parts of the world. I mean, some of the rich world might actually get better because we might be able to grow more food than we could otherwise, because carbon dioxide is actually a fertilizer, helps it to grow. But other things have to be right too. And if the temperatures go up, then food production goes down and so on. So we might even be doing better, while lots of the poor people in the world are doing much worse. So there's an absolutely inescapable moral imperative that we in the rich world should take the first action. Indeed, that is written into the Climate Convention signed in Rio in 1992, signed by President Bush Sr. and every other head of state or head of government in the world. And that says the Annex I countries, that's the rich countries, have to take the first action because we benefited from it. So if we say we're not going to do anything till the Chinese do something, that is absolutely the moral low ground. And we should not only be reducing our emissions as fast as we can go, but we should also be trying to help those in the poorer countries to develop sustainably, to develop in such ways that they can adapt to the climate change that is going to come, and also build sustainable economies. And we've got to be prepared to share our wealth and our skills with them. So when it comes to people of faith, the problem comes over with particular potency. We live in times when we're raping the earth and exploiting the poor. And the Bible has a lot to say about caring for the earth and caring for the poor. You can imagine those Old Testament prophets, Amos and Ezekiel and others, getting up in the middle of London or anywhere in the world and telling us really how badly we're behaving. We have to learn to share much more around the world. In our socialist societies, we share rather well in some ways. We share with our families, we share with our communities, we're prepared to share in all sorts of ways. We pay tax in order that we can share with the disadvantaged. But when it comes internationally, you say we give aid. Of course we give a bit of aid. But if you take aid and trade together, the net flow of wealth in the world is overwhelmingly from the poor to the rich. And we should all bow our heads in shame when we hear that statistic. It's a very frightening one. I'd just like to finish, if I may, with going to Egypt 4,000 years ago. It was one of the advanced civilizations in the world at that time. They believed they had marvelous art, they had marvelous engineering, and they believed in an afterlife. And one of the best known stories in the early Judeo-Christian scriptures, and also in the Quran, is that of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who had a worrying dream. You remember the story, you all know it. It takes up lots of chapters in our own Bibles. And the dream was about fat cows and thin cows coming up out of the river, and the thin cows ate the fat cows, you remember. And Joseph was brought along to interpret this dream, and Joseph said, it's only God who's given me that interpretation, and I'll tell you what it is. And that is that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. He gave a 14-year climate forecast. And then he was put in charge of doing something about it, and he was a very active, very able administrator, and you all know the rest of that story. And Joseph's brothers eventually came, and he said to them, he said, don't be angry that you sold me into slavery here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Because God really cared about the people in the world. And that's a very strong message that comes from those stories to all those who follow the Abrahamic religions. And today we face a climate crisis of enormous magnitude and proportions, not local but global, not of 7 years duration but lasting indefinitely. And information about it has not come from dreams. It's come from science. We say, well, how does that fit in? Because those dreams were interpreted by God. But science has nothing to do with God, you may think, reading some of the people who write these days. But if we believe in a creator God, then the science we do is God's science. It's all about the creation which belongs to him. And two important messages that climate change science is bringing are the severe impact on the world's poorest peoples and the threat to millions of the world's species, which I've just been talking about. Well, 4,000 years ago, Joseph had 7 years to prepare for his climate crisis. And action is needed just as urgently today. We have 7 years to start to turn over and to peak the emissions we have of carbon dioxide and make it reduce very rapidly so that by the middle of this century, we're largely living in a zero carbon world. The means to do that are available, and the cost is actually affordable. I could go and tell you a bit more about that from the International Energy Agency, which is the top energy body in the world. It's telling the world very loud and clear that we can do it and it's affordable. In fact, the net cost over 50 years will actually be about zero because we save so much in actually doing it. But is there the will to do it? And what sort of action should we be undertaking? I'd just like to finish by suggesting that an important area of action is in the local communities in the third world. We are trying to get sustainable energy here. They need sustainability in their energy production also. And they need to have it locally. They need to have it where they are. They don't need to, they shouldn't have to go to the cities to get their energy. They've got to do it in the country. Otherwise, the world will be full of 50 people or 100 even million, 150 million or 100 million people cities. And there's quite a lot going on in the world at the moment. And the faith communities, because they're rooted very much in local communities very often, there's a great deal we could do, I believe, in practical terms, to help those who are struggling in areas of the world which are rural and which governments as on a whole are not that interested in a way. But there are people of faith there. And if we could work together with those communities, that would be wonderful. I live in Wales, and there's a small thing starting in Wales, which is linking villages and small towns in Wales with villages and small places in Africa in partnership. And that sort of partnership, I think, would be a very wonderful thing for faith communities to begin. Thank you very much.
Let me go straight to the point, and that is the climate change and global warming is not the problem. It is only a symptom of the problem. Now, our Western societies, particularly, or modern societies generally, we are very good at treating the symptoms and overlooking the root causes of the problem. You can see that every day in our NHS and the way we treat our various diseases. So, first of all, my view, coming from a Jain, Buddhist, Hindu perspective, is that climate change is only a symptom. And we need to go further than finding various temporary, short-term solutions of the symptom, like carbon trading, is for example, or just finding some other source of energy, like nuclear, or something like that. So what is the root cause of the problem of climate change? We have to all ask, and there may be different views on that. My view is that humanity has separated itself, disconnected itself from nature. We have come to believe that nature is out there and we humans are somehow separate from nature. First of all, this separation, this disconnect, this division between nature and humans. So this is a philosophical fault line of our modern way of thinking. The moment you say nature is out there, we are not nature, although nature means birth. Like when a mother goes for a prenatal check or postnatal check, natal and native and nature come from the same root. So we are all born, are we not? How can we say we are not nature? So we have somehow confused ourselves, disconnected ourselves, and changed the meaning of the word nature. So nature out there, animals, plants, forests, rivers, mountains, oceans, nature. And we humans, not nature. The moment you make that separation, then we humans are separate, so we rule over nature. We are the masters. We are the superior species. You might be getting rid of nationalism, racism, sexism, but we are not yet thinking of getting rid of speciesism. So we are superior species, and we are the rulers of nature. So all the natural world is a resource for human use. So we can do what we like, because we are the rulers. We are the master race, master species. We can do what we like. This has been the agenda of the last 300-400 years, led by the Western countries, that we are there to exploit the resources of the natural world. We can do what we like. We can just cut down the rainforest as we like, which we have been doing. We can overfish the oceans. We can pollute the rivers. And we can pollute the atmosphere. We can use all the coal and all the gas and all the oil there is for us. I call it an arrogant human situation. I call it egocentric worldview. Ego, we, us, I am the superior, and I want to use natural world as I like. I have a freedom to exploit and use nature as I like. This is an egocentric worldview. Now we need to, if we really want to address the big fundamental cause of our predicament of climate change and global warming and poverty and injustice and social exploitation, all they are related, the dualism which we have to move from this egocentric worldview to ecocentric worldview. I'm only asking to make a small shift. Just change G to C, from egocentric to ecocentric. And this small change will prove to be a quantum leap. It's a very big paradigm shift we are talking about. So when you have an ecocentric, then our obsession with economy will be modified. For the last 200-300 years, in this pursuit of human dominance of nature, has created this idea of economy, economy, economy. Like President Clinton said in his elections, is economy stupid? I think the stupid and economy, they go quite well together. So our obsession with economy has to be modified. Unless we are prepared to take up that challenge, just global warming is not going to go away. If you fill your country with solar power, fill your country with windmills, fill your country with all other nuclear power stations, you will be in the same position in one way or the other. You don't know what the unforeseen and unpredictable circumstances and consequences there will be. So unless we need to make a fundamental shift, that's the kind of more religious, spiritual, moral imperative that we have to see, that the earth is sacred. It's a creation of God. The earth is sacred, and we are not owners of the earth. In our 300 years, 400 years of history, we have seen ourselves as the owners of the earth. We own the land, we own the animals, we own the forests, we own the rivers, we own other human beings as well. And we can use them as slaves in one way or the other. This idea of ownership has to shift, and from ownership, we have to go to relationship. We are in sacred relationship to the earth, with the earth. So when you do that, that's a very big change. We have to live within the capacity, the carrying capacity of the earth, and in harmony with the natural world. There is a greater law than the law made by humans. That's the natural law, the laws of the universe, the laws of the physics. We are not abiding by those laws, and that's why we have global warming, climate change, global poverty, hunger, starvation, etc. Only human society has this situation where we have millions of our fellow human beings go to bed without food, without shelter, without health, without any care. No other species on the earth go to hungry without food or without shelter. They don't go to bed. All other species, whether it's tigers or elephants or snakes or birds or whoever they all are fed and watered every day, but not human beings. What system? And we call ourselves highly educated. We call ourselves superior species. We call ourselves tremendous consciousness, educated in LSE, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale. And what we have created system? What kind of economic system we have designed? Completely, I wonder what kind of education we have. Half education. We learn economy without learning ecology. Ecology means knowledge of home. Oikos, home. Nomos, knowledge. And economy, oikos, home, nomos, management. How are we going to manage our home if we don't know our home? Please tell me. Thank you very much.
I want to pick out just briefly two words that Sir John came up with. The words were species and action. A lot of this debate, particularly with the intersection between faith and climate change, is often addressed as a justice issue about poor people suffering. And that's right, and that's proper, and that's an appropriate focus for people of faith. But I think it was extremely welcome that Sir John widened it to talk about the elimination of species, because I think our fundamental, and I speak as an ex-Dominican friar here, who's often ignored creation, spirituality, and the environment in my own past, the ethic is deeper than that. The Genesis creation story talks about God finding everything that he creates being good. Doesn't just wait till day 6 before humans come along, before these things have intrinsic merit and value. And if the UN tell us that 25% of animals and plants face extinction in the next 30 to 40 years, I would say that in religious terms, that's a blasphemy against God. And that's where we can find common ground with environmentalists. The world of faith and environmentalism have not always been happy bedfellows. I think people of faith do have an apology to make for often being very anthropocentric and very dismissive of the energy and passion of the green movement. But I think sometimes the green movement have often accused people of faith of peddling a view of the world which is too man-centered. And some people have got this message and others haven't. But it's time really to join hands because time is running out. The word action is now very important because if Sir John is right, we have up to 2015 to cap and reverse this process. We really do need people to walk the walk and to stop talking about this issue. I've been today in Birmingham to a United Reformed Church, and we're going to start a program next year of trying to live the future, which means that in 2050, we're going to have to live in this country at 80% cuts of our present carbon dioxide and fossil fuel use. What would that life lived now look like? Can you get your per capita emissions down from 9.5 to 10 tons a year down to 2 or 3? We're going to try and help to pilot a church to do that. I think we're all in a line, we're all looking along, we're all saying, isn't it terrible, isn't it dreadful, something must be done about it. But I think the minute people begin to make those steps forward, I think dominoes will begin to fall. And I think people of faith have got a fantastic contribution to make. I will end with one contribution. I've just been, for the last 2.5 days prior to Birmingham, at Windsor Castle with Prince Philip and the UN Secretary General. 250 people came from around the world to make 7-year plan pledges of what their own faiths will do to combat climate change. We had Lutherans from Tanzania pledging to plant 9 million trees. We've had the Grand Mufti of Egypt pledging to produce Qurans on sustainable paper from proper forests which are accredited for their good virtues, if you like. And we also had a bunch of Taoists coming from China, permitted to travel by the Chinese government simply to tell us that every single Taoist temple in China from 2015 will be solar panelled. These are just some of the small but important stories, and we need more of them. Thank you.
I should explain that I wear kind of two hats. I am the executive director of Friends of the Earth, an avowedly secular campaigning charity promoting a healthy planet for all. Some of you will know I'm also a practicing Christian and have worked for many years in the development sector, particularly with church-linked development NGOs campaigning around environmental issues. So to some, I'm a bit of a strange fish. To me, that's totally natural. Let me comment on what I see as a very big challenge we all face, and then draw on some of the principles and the values that I think are implicit and explicit in what you've said. I mentioned a couple of more that we could then debate and see how that helps us move forward. I think one massive challenge we all humans face right now, and it's getting incredibly acute today as we speak in Barcelona, where they are negotiating for a climate change treaty which is meant to conclude in 5 weeks' time. Here is the challenge. Most of the public and most politicians are on a different planet in terms of what the science and the economics says is necessary if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change. To pick up on a couple of points of Sir John and elaborate a bit. Rich countries have to reduce our emissions by 40% by 2020, for example, to have a reasonable chance, a 50-50 chance, that's actually not very reasonable, of avoiding runaway climate change. We have to peak and decline globally in emissions by 2015, only 6 years away. And that means rich countries go hard and fast so developing countries can keep emitting for a while before they peak. We've actually got to make anything between 160 and $200 billion worth of additional finance, additional to current aid, available to developing countries so that they can adapt to existing climate change and what's to come and go green, go to a low carbon economy. What is currently on the table at Barcelona and Copenhagen is nothing like what is required. Okay? Now that presents a massive challenge to us all. First of all, we need much greater ambition and boldness from our politicians. We actually need much greater public pressure on those politicians so that, particularly in democratic countries, but also in so-called non-democratic countries, politicians have the demand from the people to move. And we also need people to get used to the idea of a radically different lifestyle, which actually is a lifestyle I believe can be very much better than our current one, but it will be radically different. So, how can faith and faith groups and faith principles help us with some of these things? First of all, I think faith leaders and faith activists have a critical role to play in reconnecting their own communities with the values and the principles that support care for the environment, support care for people. Now, that should be obvious, but I'm a Christian. I know that I was brought up in a household where, thankfully, it was taken as read that because we are Christians, we care for the environment. But I could visit many other Christian homes where that was not at all obvious to people. I've spent a lot of time actually privileged to be working with Joel and Sir John, with evangelical Christians in the United States, where to say that because you are a Christian you should care for the environment, at one stage could have got you pilloried. So let's be clear, the first thing church leaders and other faith group leaders have to do is to get their own communities on board with what their own teaching and principles say about this question. And a lot of great work is going on, and I've been a part of it, but there is more to be done. The second thing is it mustn't stop at just awareness of the problem. We have got to mobilize large numbers of people to put pressure on politicians for change, urgently and in the long term. Now, the good news is, again, many faith groups are already doing this. But I also know that there are people in faith groups for whom political action is also anathema. It would never occur to them that they could, on account of their faith, engage in politics. Not even send a postcard to their prime minister. It would be regarded as, that's for somebody else, not for us. Now, I know loads of Christians and other faith people have always thought the opposite. I'm one of them. But there are those that don't. So we've got to use, and faith leaders and activists have to use those principles to mobilize their people, their communities for political action, locally and nationally. Lastly, I think that there are so many principles that we could draw upon in this, and we can open these out in discussion. Let me just point to two. Justice, we've already mentioned that. But I can't think of a case in world history where the lack of justice by a few privileged countries is not just going to upset a negotiation or disturb international relations. It could genuinely sink the planet. We are in unprecedented territory in terms of what injustice could do to us all. So unless rich countries rapidly move in putting more on the table in the negotiations in terms of the emissions they are prepared to cut and the money they are prepared to transfer, in the end, it will get us all. The second thing, which I think is a feature of many faiths, and the story of Joseph is a good example, is that one of the moral imperative to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and to not worry about the risk to you personally or the disadvantage to you personally. We have got to have boldness and courage to do the right thing on climate change and demand that our political leaders do the right thing, and to overcome the narrow national interest or their perceptions of it and the political risk to them of sticking their head out. Otherwise, we are sunk. So we collectively have to help our political leaders not just close the gap between the science and the economics and where they are now, but to close the gap between the kind of political leadership, boldness and courage that we need because it's the right thing, even if it's risky, and where they currently are. And I think faith groups have an enormous role to play in that because of the moral authority they carry with so many people, and because, whether at national level or at grassroots level, they are there often when others are not.